Two seasoned cave divers descend into a treacherous, unexplored cave to chart the unknown. But as the walls close in and the stakes rise, their mission spirals into a nightmare that turned into a series of near-death encounters until one final mistake sealed their fate.
Dark greetings, love. I am your host of Gothic Sagas, where we share eerie tales of unexplained disappearances, strange occurrences, bizarre accidents, and just plain unsettling, creepy stories. If this kind of content piques your curiosity, hit the subscribe button, terrorize the like button, and ring our bell. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's venture into the depths where shadows dance and secrets lurk.
About 100 miles east of Albuquerque, New Mexico, lies the small town of Santa Rosa. Just outside the city is a popular swimming hole that at first glance appears to be nothing more than an ordinary pond. Surrounded by scattered trees and rocky outcrops, its most striking feature is the brilliant crystal blue color of the water. This vivid hue immediately hints that the pond is far deeper and clearer than it seems. In reality, it's anything but shallow or murky. Surprisingly, this seemingly modest spot is actually one of the most renowned diving locations in the United States. The Blue Hole is situated right along the historic Route 66, one of the original U.S. highways established in the 1920s. Since then, it has become a popular stop for travelers. However, long before the highway was built, dirt roads crisscrossed the area, and the Blue Hole served as a vital water source for cattle drivers and weary travelers making their way across the arid desert. Even earlier, indigenous peoples had relied on the spring for centuries, perhaps even thousands of years, as an endless supply of fresh water and a place to escape the desert heat. The full history of its use is unknown, as there are no written records from those ancient times. The Blue Hole is what's known as a natural artesian well, a spring fed by underground water under immense pressure. This pressure forces the water to flow at astonishing rates. In fact, the Blue Hole has a constant inflow of around 3,000 gallons per minute, enough to fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool in under 3 hours. Incredibly, the water in the hole fully replenishes itself roughly every 6 hours. This continuous cycle of fresh water is what keeps the hole remarkably clear, with visibility often exceeding 100 feet. The temperature remains a steady 62 degrees Fahrenheit, or 17 degrees Celsius, year-round, making it an ideal spot for divers. And yet there's still more to this fascinating place. At the surface, the Blue Hole spans roughly 80 feet in diameter. However, as you descend, the shape begins to change. The walls narrow into an hourglass formation before gradually expanding again. By the time you reach the bottom, at around 80 feet deep, the diameter stretches to nearly 130 feet, or 39.6 meters. Scattered along the bottom are various objects, including large boulders and chunks of rubble, which are to be expected. But there are also more curious items, scattered bones, a crucifix, and on the eastern side, a small opening. This opening is sealed by a metal grate, marking the entrance to an ominous underwater cavern system. Like most natural springs, the water's path through the earth isn't straightforward. Over thousands of years, it is carved through the softest, most soluble rock, creating an unpredictable network of tunnels, corridors, and massive chambers. Some passages are wide and open, while others are narrow and claustrophobic. From the surface, there's no way to tell what the hidden cave system looks like. You have to venture inside to find out. While most people are perfectly content to admire the Blue Hole from above, a few daring individuals are eager to explore its shadowy depths. Unfortunately, the metal grate sealing the entrance hasn't always been in place. For years, the cavern lay open, drawing the curiosity of daring divers. The Blue Hole is a popular destination for scuba diving students from all over the country. Its crystal clear water, consistent temperature, and lack of currents make it an ideal training ground. With conditions similar to a massive, open swimming pool, it offers a safe and controlled environment for beginners to practice. This combination of factors is part of what makes the Blue Hole such a widely favored diving spot. In March of 1976, a group of 10 students, accompanied by their instructor, arrived at the visitor center parking lot. Eager to take advantage of the perfect conditions, they prepared for what they expected to be a routine day of scuba training. The group of students, hailing from the University of Oklahoma, had planned to capture underwater photos as part of the class project. By around 10:30 a.m., they were suited up in their scuba gear and ready to dive. Among them were two students, Mike and David, who slipped into the water alongside the others. Before the dive, the instructor gave clear safety instructions. No one was to linger at the bottom for too long, and under no circumstances were they to enter the cave on the eastern side of the hole. However, for some, that warning felt more like a challenge. As they explored the depths, Mike and David eventually found themselves at the bottom, staring at the small 4-foot opening leading into the forbidden cave. Their curiosity quickly outweighed their caution. Exchanging glances and hand signals, they made a fateful decision. They would ignore the warning and venture inside. The cave entrance dropped about 15 feet, or 4.6 meters, straight down, and the conditions immediately changed. The once spacious and pristine waters of the Blue Hole gave way to a narrow, more claustrophobic space. The walls and floor were rough, jagged, and coated with sand, clouding the water. Still, the pair pressed on. At the base of the descent, they reached a large corridor that forked in two directions at a sharp 60-degree angle. Glancing behind them, they saw only a dead end, but ahead, the cave sloped deeper, splitting off into a maze of hidden rooms and passages. While the tunnels inside the cave are relatively spacious, they pose a hidden danger for inexperienced divers. Without proper training, it's easy to unintentionally kick up sand and silt from the bottom with every movement. The problem is, divers are typically focused on what's ahead, unaware of the cloud of debris forming behind them. It's only when they turn around that they realize they've completely obscured the way out. As Mike and David pressed deeper into the cave, they unknowingly sealed their own fate. With each stroke, they stirred up more silt, reducing visibility to nearly zero. When they finally turned back, they were met with nothing but a thick, disorienting cloud of debris. The path they had entered through was now indistinguishable. Surrounded by swirling particles, they quickly lost all sense of direction. In the twisting maze-like tunnels, it became impossible to tell which way was up or down. This is the moment when panic usually takes hold, a deadly trap for even the most seasoned divers. As you blindly grope through the swirling silt, a sinking dread takes hold. You realize you've made a terrible mistake, and your air supply is running out. With every desperate breath, you start to hyperventilate. Panic sets in and you begin moving frantically, far faster than you should. But this only makes things worse. Your rapid movements stir up even more silt, further reducing visibility. Disoriented, you crash into jagged walls and scrape against the ceiling. Then suddenly, you take a breath, and it feels like you're sucking through a straw. Your tank is empty. You've run out of air. Back at the surface, the remaining students and their instructor soon realized that something was wrong. David and Mike hadn't resurfaced. Fearing the worst, they called for help. Later that afternoon, a team of rescue divers descended into the cave. Unlike the two students, they came prepared, running a 100-foot or 30.5 meter guideline from the cave's entrance. This safety line allowed them to find their way back, even if the water became clouded with silt. During the search, they soon located Mike's body. He was found near the entrance of one of the many branching rooms connected to the main corridor. However, David was still missing, and finding him would take much longer. At the time, cave diving was still in its early stages, and even the rescue operation was largely made up of volunteers. The conditions were so hazardous that many of the rescuers refused to enter. The depth itself was dangerous, but the cave's cramped passages made things even more treacherous. Due to the narrow tunnels, it was only practical to send in one diver at a time. Over the next several days, the team pushed deeper and deeper, eventually reaching a depth of 181 feet, or 55.2 meters, more than twice the depth of the cave's initial entrance. During the search, One diver made his way to the end of the long corridor. When he aimed his high-powered flashlight into the chamber, the beam barely penetrated the darkness. The room was so massive that he couldn't even see the bottom. Perhaps the most terrifying part of the rescue effort, however, was the ceiling itself. The divers exhaled bubbles were dislodging loose rocks, creating a constant threat from above. In one instance, a rock nearly a foot wide struck a diver square in the back. In another, a massive 2-foot wide boulder, likely weighing several hundred pounds, brushed against a diver as he carefully navigated the shadowy tunnels. After 4 grueling days, on March the 14th, the search was called off. The water had become too murky due to shifting surface pressure, making further exploration impossible. To prevent future tragedies, a 300-pound, 136.1 kilogram metal grate was lowered over the cave's entrance, permanently sealing it off from divers. It wasn't until more than a month later, when the grate was temporarily removed, that David's body was finally recovered. Surprisingly, it was found at a depth of only 130 feet, far shallower than where the rescue team had searched. Despite this, locating him had been a monumental challenge due to the cave's labyrinth of rooms, offshoots, and narrow crevices, all of which had been painstakingly checked. Once David's body was recovered, the grate was reinstalled and it remained in place for nearly 40 years. Then, 37 years later, a diving group called the ADM, Exploration Foundation, reached out to the city of Santa Rosa. They requested permission to map and explore the cave, which had remained sealed all those years. After carefully planning and securing the necessary permits, the city finally granted them access. The team's first task was to remove the massive metal grate blocking the entrance. However, when they did, they were met with an unexpected obstacle. Tons of rock and rubble completely clogged the passage. Unbeknownst to the city, the U.S. Army had dumped 2 truckloads of stone over the entrance, effectively sealing the cave far more thoroughly than anyone had realized. Before the exploration could even begin, the team had to dredge the bottom of the cave and clear away the massive amount of debris blocking the entrance. The process was slow and grueling. Eventually, they were left with one enormous boulder that completely obstructed the passage, bringing their progress to a halt for another 3 years. Finally, in 2016, the path was clear enough for the mapping mission to commence. Leading the exploration was legendary cave diver Mike Young, accompanied by a team of elite divers, including Navy diver Shane Thompson. Over the course of several days, Young and Thompson carefully mapped the cave, running fixed lines along the way to ensure they could always find their way back, avoiding the tragic mistakes of the past. By March the 26th, they had pushed as far as they could, reaching a depth of 195 feet, or 59.4 meters. Though it was possible they could have gone slightly deeper, they ultimately decided against it. The cave's deepest section was packed with rocks, which would have required extensive clearing to explore further, a task that was simply too labor-intensive and risky to take on. Instead of continuing with their deep exploration, the team decided that their final dive would be a simpler one. Mike planned to make one last descent to check for any overlooked passages and to retrieve the fixed line that he had placed at the bottom. It's unclear whether the cave had always been in the same condition or if it had changed over time, but when Mike and Shane explored it, they encountered massive rocks and boulders beyond the 140-foot or 42.6 meter mark. The tunnels weren't just narrow passages, they were also clogged with car-sized boulders, making navigation even more dangerous. To progress, the divers were forced to squeeze through the cracks and narrow gaps between the unstable rocks. In some areas, they didn't even have enough room to turn around. At times, they had to clear smaller rocks by hand, which was extremely risky. Removing the wrong stone could easily dislodge one of the larger, heavier boulders, creating a deadly cave-in. In fact, the cave was so perilous that until the second to the last day of their exploration, only Mike had managed to squeeze through the tightest restriction at 140 feet. When Shane finally made it through, they decided he would accompany Mike on the final dive to their pre-planned depth. After passing the first restriction, the two men entered a tunnel littered with rocks and debris along the bottom, leaving them with just a few feet of clearance below the ceiling. Despite the cramped space, the passage was relatively decent by cave diving standards. It was about 6 feet, 1.83 meters wide, and the water remained clear with little silt being kicked up as they swam. When they reached the next restriction, Mike turned to Shane and raised his hand, signaling him to stop. According to their plan, this was where Shane was supposed to wait while Mike continued to head along. With far more experience, Mike was better equipped to navigate the next section, which was so narrow and confined that it made sense for only one diver to proceed. After signaling Shane to wait, Mike turned and swam towards a narrow crack between the boulders. With a bit of effort, he squeezed through the tight gap until his fins disappeared from view. Beyond this point, the cave became even more perilous. The passage was little more than a series of jagged restrictions, with Mike forced to pull himself through the narrow gaps using only his arms. Despite the treacherous terrain, he reached the line without any trouble and was about to remove it. However, just before cutting the line, Mike had a thought. It should be filmed. The team had also been documenting their exploration of the blue hole, and Shane had been wearing a camera to capture the journey. Instead of removing the line right away, Mike decided to swim back and get the camera to record the process. But as he turned around, he was met with a familiar sight. The path was completely clouded with silt. In such tight quarters, no matter how careful a diver is, it's impossible to avoid brushing against the rocks and kicking up some sediment. The once clear route was now a blinding wall of debris. Fortunately, Mike wasn't too concerned. He was following a guideline, which would safely lead him back. However, after swimming only a few feet, he unexpectedly ran straight into Shane. Unbeknownst to Mike, the moment his fins had vanished from view, Shane had ignored their plan and followed after him. Overcome with curiosity, he impulsively decided he wanted to see the rest of the cave. Going against everything they had agreed on, Shane had pushed forward through the same dangerous passage. By the time the two collided, Shane had already passed through 5 tight restrictions. Worse still, he was partially wedged in the narrow tunnel and beginning to panic. Mike was stunned. He knew firsthand how difficult the restrictions had been. Turning back through them would be nearly impossible. When the initial shock wore off, Mike calmly instructed Shane to turn around. But Shane's panicked response was chilling. He couldn't. Trapped between jagged boulders, there was simply no room for him to maneuver or turn back. He was stuck. Realizing Shane was hopelessly stuck, Mike quickly backed out of the narrow opening. With no other choice, he grabbed Shane and yanked him with all his strength. The passage was so tight that Mike genuinely feared he might break Shane's legs in the process. But after a desperate struggle, he finally managed to pull Shane free and turn him around. The two of them began squeezing their way back through the boulder-filled tunnel toward the exit. Though the thick silt obscured his vision, Mike could feel the tension of the guideline moving in his hands, reassure him that Shane was still making progress behind him. Then, without warning, the line was violently ripped from Mike's grip, yanked so hard that it seemed as if Shane had suddenly pulled on it with all his strength. Instantly, Mike's heart began to race. Frantically, he patted the rocks around him, desperately searching for the line, their only lifeline. Without it, he had no clear path out of the deadly maze. His breathing quickened as panic threatened to set in. But, thankfully, Mike's experience took over. He reminded himself that he had enough air supply to last all day if necessary. There was no need to rush. He just needed to calm himself down. For a moment, he sat still, slowing his breathing and regaining his composure. Once he was steady, he began feeling his way around again. Though he had lost the line, he was fairly confident he was still heading in the right direction. After a few tense moments of searching, he felt a small opening and cautiously pushed through it, continuing to pat along the rocky walls. In a stroke of pure luck, his hand finally brushed against the guideline. Relieved, he took a deep breath and clung to the line, carefully following it through the tangle of boulders. Then out of nowhere, he felt something grab him, Shane's arm, reaching blindly through a narrow gap. Right away, Mike could tell by the frantic way Shane's arm was moving that he was in full-blown panic mode. His movements were wild and erratic, a clear sign that he was terrified in losing control. Without hesitation, Mike gripped Shane's arm firmly, trying to reassure him with his touch. He quickly scanned the area for any nearby opening large enough to free Shane from the tight space. Finally, he spotted a larger gap nearby. Carefully but firmly, he guided Shane towards it, pulling him through the opening and freeing him from the claustrophobic trap. Despite being freed from the previous restriction, Shane was still in full-blown panic. However, he seemed to recognize that Mike had found a possible way out. Unfortunately, as soon as Shane spotted the opening, he began scrambling forward with reckless desperation. In his frenzied attempt to escape, Shane pushed forward so chaotically that he accidentally wedged himself beneath Mike in the narrow tunnel. The space was so tight that they became tangled together. Shane's head ended up near Mike's feet, while Mike's head was by Shane's feet. Now completely stuck, Shane's panic only intensified. He flailed his legs wildly, kicking with his fin in every direction. Mike had to shield his face from the sharp blows as Shane thrashed uncontrollably. In the chaos, one of Shane's kicks struck a valve on Mike's dry suit, breaking it. Frigid water immediately began flooding into the suit, making an already dire situation even worse. Realizing they were in serious trouble, Mike knew he had to get them unstuck, fast. Using every ounce of strength, he braced himself against the rocky tunnel. With great effort, he managed to wedge one of his legs into a crack in the cave wall. This gave Shane just enough room to wiggle and squirm through the narrow passage, finally freeing them both. However, the struggle came at a cost. As Shane squeezed through the gap, he accidentally tore one of Mike's fins off. To make matters worse, the force of being pushed free propelled Mike forward through the same opening Shane had just escaped from, sending him further into the tight passageway. Once free, Mike paused for a moment, his heart pounding. He sat still, struggling to calm himself, an even greater challenge this time, given the nightmare series of events. Eventually, once his breathing slowed and he regained control, he carefully slipped out of the narrow opening he had been forced through. Now disoriented once again, he began padding around the jagged rocks, trying to feel for an exit in the direction he believed led up and out. Then, in an almost miraculous stroke of luck, his hand brushed against something familiar, his missing fin, laying on the rocks. The small but unexpected discovery gave him an overwhelming sense of relief. It was almost symbolic, as though finding the lost fin was a sign that he still had a chance of making it out alive. Feeling a renewed sense of hope, Mike secured the fin and continued swimming in the direction he believed would lead him back to safety. Then, against all odds, he stumbled upon a small area where the silt had cleared enough to give him some visibility. Relieved, he swam toward the clear water and, to his astonishment, spotted the guide line once again. Grabbing hold of it, he noticed something unexpected. The line was still moving slightly. This meant Shane was still alive somewhere beyond the thick cloud of silt, struggling somewhere in the maze of boulders. Without hesitation, Mike turned towards the direction of the movement and immediately began swimming, determined to help his partner. But just as he pushed forward, the line suddenly went limp. In that instant, Mike's heart sank. He knew exactly what it meant. Shane was gone. Despite the crushing realization, Mike pressed on. He squeezed through the narrow corridor and soon came up on Shane's lifeless body. The scene was haunting, but without pausing, Mike robotically began removing Shane's gear to prepare him for recovery. However, as he worked, a grim realization struck him. His dry suit was still partially filled with freezing water, and he had significant decompression stops ahead before he could safely surface. There was simply no way he could safely bring Shane's body out at that moment. Accepting the harsh reality, Mike made the difficult decision to leave Shane behind for now. With a heavy heart, he turned and followed the guideline through the winding maze of boulders and restrictions. After what felt like an eternity, he finally reached the safety divers waiting just above the cave entrance. Through hand signals, he communicated the devastating news. Shane wasn't coming back. Then he began the long and grueling 2-hour decompression ascent. Between the earlier chaos, the numbing cold of his flooded suit, and the sorrow of losing his diving partner, the decompression was pure agony. His body was exhausted and his mind was reeling from the traumatic events. When he finally surfaced, he was met with warmth and support. He spent some of his time regaining his composure, warming up and calming down. But as he spoke with the police, explaining what had occurred deep below, a heavy realization settled over him. He was the only person capable of retrieving Shane's body. No matter how much he wanted to be done with the cave, he knew it was inevitable. Sooner or later, he would have to go back down. Despite the grueling ordeal he had just endured, Mike was determined to return and recover Shane's body immediately, even if it meant diving again that very night. However, the rest of the team intervened. They convinced him to wait until morning, knowing he needed time to rest and recover from the physically and emotionally draining dive. When Shane's body was finally brought back to the surface, the team reviewed the camera footage to piece together exactly what had happened. The video revealed that Shane had followed Mike through the second restriction almost immediately after Mike disappeared from view, completely disregarding the prearranged plan. The footage also confirmed a tragic detail. Shane's extreme panic had caused him to breathe so heavily that he overwhelmed the rebreather system he was using. This forced him to switch to his emergency gas supply. In his frantic state, he burned through that reserve alarmingly fast. Yet, gripped by fear and confusion, he never switched back to his primary system, sealing his fate. When they recovered him, Shane's suit was in tatters. It was torn to shreds from violently scraping and thrashing against the jagged boulders as he desperately tried to force his way through the narrow tunnels. Ultimately, although the expedition succeeded in mapping the cave, it came at an unimaginable cost. It was never meant to be a recovery mission. One of the team's original hopes for the exploration was to map the cave in the hopes that it would eventually be opened as a dive site for local cave divers. However, after what they had witnessed, that idea was quickly abandoned. Mike, a seasoned and highly experienced diver, described the cave as one of the most treacherous he had ever encountered. Even if the cave were dredged and properly lined, the enormous boulders, tight restrictions, and unstable passages would make it far too dangerous for all but the most advanced technical divers. He would later describe one particular hair-raising restriction, a small opening that required divers to squeeze underneath a massive, multi-ton boulder. The terrifying part was that the boulder was precariously balanced on a thin lip of rock. One minor shift could cause it to collapse without warning. In the end, it was decided the cave was simply too deadly. For safety's sake, the entrance was sealed permanently. A new heavy-duty metal grate was installed over the opening, ensuring that no one would ever enter the cave again. Despite the tragedy, the Blue Hole of Santa Rosa remains a popular and safe dive site today. Its crystal clear waters and stable conditions continue to attract swimmers and divers from all over the country. However, beneath the surface lies the dark and dangerous cavern, forever off limits, a grim reminder of the perils that claimed the life of Shane Thompson.
And that will do it for today. Thank you for watching and hanging out. It really means a lot to me. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video. And we look forward to seeing you next time. But until then, blessings and positive energy to you, love.